Well, hello, everybody. I'm talking with a musical accompaniment here. And yeah, welcome to the Declaration Lounge. Um, we would like to see the room. We need to know whether our on-site moderator is there. That's good. Excellent. And I think I see Henriette over there. Hello, hello. All right, and we're still waiting for Dhruva.
Milton, I think everyone's here. I think we just need the door to be closed and then you can start. And people to cease their personal conversations.
Okay. Cease your conversations. This is a dialogue on the future of the internet, and there will be no talking. Right. So let's go ahead and start. I am Milton Mueller. I'm at Georgia Tech at the Internet Governance Project there. Andreas, would you like to introduce yourself?
Happy to. Good morning, everyone. Andreas Kuhn, a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation America, and I'm very happy to co-organize this session with Milton. And then thank you, everyone, for being here this morning, this afternoon, or wherever, depending wherever you are.
So let me just share my screen if I can. No, I can't. We think that the Declaration for the Future of the Internet was an important initiative, and it was a very interesting and complex initiative because we're trying to deal with sort of defending the multi-stakeholder free and open internet. And there's always been some trouble about what is the role of governments in that. To many of us, governments have been one of the main threats to the freedom of the internet. And we have promoted private sector-led and multi-stakeholder governance. But at the same time, it's good to, for governments themselves to take the initiative to recommit themselves to some of the principles that made the internet successful. And that is something that, governments in some ways have to take the initiative to do. So if you look at the substance of the Declaration, you find that it is reclaiming the promise of the internet. It talks about the, sort of that early vision of how the internet was changing things and making information more accessible and more open. And essentially, they are proposing now to meet the challenges of the negative aspects of the internet by reaffirming the good things about it and taking certain steps to advance that vision in the current context. So the key principles are the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms, the globalism of the internet, that is refraining from shutdowns, refraining from blocking or degrading access. The next one is an inclusive and affordable access to the internet. So we're talking about promoting affordable broadband access to the internet, supporting digital literacy and skills acquisition, fostering greater exposure to diverse cultural and multilingual content, and so on. And then there's the trust problem, the issue of cybersecurity. So combating cybercrime, promoting the protection of consumers from online scams, trustworthy network infrastructure and services, and a rules-based global digital economy, which fosters trade in contestable and fair online markets. And the final principle is indeed multi-stakeholder internet governance. So today we have brought together a group of people who are both signatories to the declaration and people from countries who are not. And let me just briefly mention who our panelists are. We have with us Alan Davidson, who is the Assistant Secretary for Commerce in the United States government. And I know that Alan has been involved in ICANN and other civil society advocacy groups before he entered government. And I think he worked for Google at some point also. So he has a good range of experience and is now in government as a policymaker. We also have Luis Marie Harel, who is Brazilian, who is a cybersecurity scholar studying at the London School of Economics. And she has also worked in a research institute in Brazil, although she recently shifted to one based in the UK. So she has a global South perspective, but one that is very integrated with the entire internet ecology. Henrietta Esterhuizen is another civil society person, and she is from Africa. She has been extremely active in internet governance since the World Summit on the Information Society and is from South Africa. We also have Dhruva Jaishankar. Is Dhruva successfully on now? Okay, good. Yes, there he is. All right. So Dhruva is working for the Observer Research Foundation in the Americas. I believe he's the vice president, and he is from India. And ORF, as if we want to use the acronym, is one of the major policy think tanks in India. And then we have Regina Greenberger, who is the cyber ambassador from Germany. And Regina also has been actively participating in IGFs and I think has been involved with ICANN's GAC for some time. So let's get down to it. I think the most important question we want to start with is essentially a simple one. I'm going to go through the panelists and simply ask them, did your country sign or did it not sign the declaration, and why or why not? So let's start with Regina.
Actually, we did. As all EU member states did sign the declaration for the future of the internet, EU and all member states, and even Hungary, which was not invited to the Summit for Democracy itself, but also they, at least in the end, aligned with themselves with this declaration. Germany is also part of the Freedom Online Coalition, and our first sentiment when we saw the initial drafts was, I mean, that's basically the same idea, that we are standing up for freedom online, for human rights online, for some basic principles. When we discussed the declaration for the future of the internet on this global stage, international stage, at the same time we had also an internal discussion within the EU about something that was also called a declaration on digital rights and principles for the digital decade. And I think that's what you said, Milton, that was also true for all the Europeans, that policymakers, but also stakeholders and whole societies needed some self-assurance where they stand in terms of digital transformation and where to go from there. As you said, that we need some we wanted also to, as governments, to have some recommitment to the basic principles of the internet. And there are actually some questions that have to be reconsidered from time to time as the developments on the ground request this. For example, a rebalancing between the roles of public and private sectors. Then, of course, between private sector, industry, and civil society, and in Europe also between big tech and alternative ecosystems, like our European digital ecosystem, which is quite different, for example, from the American one. So that would be my answer.
Very good. Now I'd like to turn to Dhruva, if I could ask you, did India sign the declaration, and if so, why or why not?
So thank you for having me, and my apologies, I'm having some connectivity issues, but it seems like I can join for this. So India did not sign the declaration, and there are many possible reasons for this. I've spoken to many of the people involved on the policy side, on the Indian side, but largely I think it comes down to two different sets of issues, and these are not unique to this particular initiative. One is a question of process. And I think the feeling is, there wasn't a sufficient sort of a consultative process, and there are other mechanisms, including the multilateral mechanisms that could have been used to do this. This is, as many of you know, an outgrowth of the Biden administration's push, also as part of the Summit for Democracy, in which India, amongst others, did participate. But that being said, I think that there were some questions about the processual issues. The second aspect is also more on substance. And, for example, India previously had not signed on to statements concerning the free flow of information, say at the G20 summit that was pushed a little while ago. And some of the concerns that India has, I think, is sort of an insufficient emphasis on national security. And then some questions about where some of the principles, including, say, on some of the democratic principles that were mentioned in the declaration, what interpretations of what exactly that means. And so I think so on both on substantive grounds and on the mechanics of how it came about, I think there were those concerns.
Can you tell us a bit more about the process? What were the concerns with the process?
I think just in terms of, this grew out of a Biden administration initiative. I think it appears that there was very good consultation with European allies. But generally, I think sort of the global South, including India, isn't often brought in sufficiently at an early stage in some of these discussions. And so as a consequence, we saw most of the countries that have signed up tend to be, with a few exceptions, tend to be largely US allies.
Okay, thank you. Well, why don't we turn to Henriette next, if you're ready, Henriette. What was South Africa's role or position on the declaration? And I know that you don't speak for the state, but you probably know a bit more about it than most of us.
Well, South Africa has not signed onto the declaration. I don't know what their stance on it would be. I can guess. But firstly, why did South Africa not sign? Process, as Dhruva said. South Africa generally, and they're quite explicit about this, if you speak to the Directorate on International Cooperation, South Africa generally has an in-principle position that they do not sign onto documents that they did not negotiate. That's, in my experience, fairly common in BRICS states. In fact, I think it's one of the discussions within the BRICS states. And this is in response to a tendency for countries in the global north to develop statements or positions and then expect like-minded allies in the global south to sign on. South Africa is very firm on this. I've been at negotiations at the OECD where there's a document that South Africa, as an observer of the OECD, has been invited to sign on to, and they like the document, but they will not sign on because they weren't part of the process of negotiating the text. Secondly, I would say, as far as the content is concerned, I think there's broad alignment. I have a colleague here from South Africa, Alison Gilwart, who can comment. I think broad alignment with most of the principles. except perhaps the one on multi-stakeholder internet governance. I think in the way that it's framed, the South African government would have concerns about it. They are still of a view that the discussion on enhanced cooperation has not been complete in the post-WSIS era. They still feel there's a need for more governmental oversight over internet governance. In general, their view is that multi-stakeholder participation is what you do at home, not necessarily what you do globally. Back to you, Milton.
Good. So let's go now to Luis from Brazil. And again, let us know what you know about the reasons why Brazil did not sign.
Absolutely. So again, not speaking on behalf of Brazil and don't intend necessarily to do so. First, because the reasons why have not been made public, and second, because I'm also not a government representative. But I think there is an IBSA alignment over here in terms of not signing the declaration. So Brazil didn't sign. So 6 Latin American countries signed the declaration, 9 if we're considering the LAC region, but Brazil did not. And first, I think there is, as I said, a NIBSA alignment in terms of thinking about process. So also historically, Brazil, as a country that that plays with its strategic ambiguity in terms of foreign policy, does not sign documents that it has not been included in conceiving or in the negotiation phase. So that is also something to be considered there. And just to give an example, right? I mean, the Budapest Convention, Brazil, it took 20 years for Brazil to actually sign the Budapest Convention. And that just happened like 2 days ago, it was officialized. So, and the other one, another example is the Paris Call. Brazil also didn't sign the Paris Call, and probably also because it wasn't included. And of course, of measuring what are the different interests in the negotiation phase. That is something that really plays into historically in terms of Brazil's own vision around not just internet governance, but foreign policy more generally, right? But I don't think that, unlike India and somehow aligned with South Africa, it's not because of content. I think it's more of political ambiguity, because in terms of content, when we think about the discussion, it's not necessarily a discussion about signing or not signing because of content. It's more because, historically Brazil has, a whole international projection in terms of its multi-stakeholder governance at the national level. One could argue that it's a bit different when we think about, maybe it's more multi-stakeholder prone nationally than internationally in terms of narrative. But still, it does have that kind of the steering committee, and also the principles outlined and many of the subject areas outlined in the declaration, they are almost the same as the decalogue of principles that the Internet Steering Committee published in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. So it's definitely not about content. And I think we should also position when this declaration is coming to the fore, right? I think it is coming to a moment where we're looking against the backdrop of a geopolitical context where proposals related to technology governance more broadly, they are increasingly tied to adversarial logics. And for countries in the global south, for countries that are normally called swing states, right, they want to play on their strategic ambiguity to say when they want to or not do that. So I think one keyword is calibration in maintaining that strategic ambiguity in terms of foreign policy. And just to kind of close with 2 extra points, I think, Brazil wants to maintain a working relationship with other countries such as China and Russia. So there's some moments that they're not going to do that. And one example that I could give here is, for example, like in terms of calibration, Brazil did join the International Counter Ransomware Initiative. And that is a US-led kind of initiative, right? But you cannot say precisely why. Sometimes that strategic and geopolitical calculus will be stronger, and at other times it won't be, right? So that's quite interesting. There's no formula to that in that sense. And finally, I think there's another element, another layer to Brazil's thinking. It's whether this is part of the political considerations at the domestic level, right? Is that actually important at the national level right now, since we're having so many other discussions, to actually have a clear position on the declaration, right? Even though the U.S. is a huge partner and you know, they have been working for many years. So that's basically my thoughts around that.
It's a very good explanation, and I appreciate that. And I think that opens the door to some further discussion, and we'll follow up on the question of whether whether this whole idea is maybe not a good one. But in that regards, let's turn to Alan Davidson of the U.S., which was generally perceived as the initiator of the declaration. And Alan, tell us, you know, obviously the U.S. signed, but what do you think about the progress of the initiative, and what you think of what you've heard about the people who didn't sign it?
Well, first of all, thank you, Milton, and it's terrific to be able to join you all remotely. And I'll say, of course, the U.S. did sign and was proud to be a leader along with the European Commission in gathering over 60 partners, you know, from Latin America and Asia and Africa, as we've heard, to launch the declaration in April. And it was a signal, it was designed to be a signal of a shared positive vision for the future of the internet. An internet that's, as we've seen, open, free, global, interoperable, reliable, secure. And those are incredibly important first principles for us to be putting a marker down on, for us to be, you know, kind of reclaiming with this document. And I would say, you know, just for context, you know, I think this came at a moment where there was a growing sense of urgency about the need to recommit to those first principles, right? Part of that is about the increasingly central role that the internet plays in all of our lives around the world. Another part of that was the rising trend of, is the rising trend of digital authoritarianism that we are so concerned about, that threatens that open, global, interoperable vision of the internet. And, you know, I think this also came at a moment at the very beginning of the Biden administration when we felt it was particularly important for countries to be stepping up and recommitting to that vision. So, you know, there was a sense of urgency, I would say, that I think informed a lot of this work. And the hope now is that moving forward, we look and see if we can attract more countries to this document based on what we think of very strong substance, very strong positive vision about what the internet can and should be. It has a strong embrace of multi-stakeholderism, which continues to, we believe, and I think all the signatories believe, is the right path forward for promoting these principles. There is also real value, and I know there is a lot that we should explore about process, and particularly the role of the multi-stakeholder community. There is also arguably a role for government-to-government statements of principle. And this offers an opportunity, I would say, for the multi-stakeholder community to hold countries to account. This binds us. This is a statement, and we now, I think, should invite the multi-stakeholder community to try to gather more countries into this, to adopt this statement of principles, but also to think about how to hold us all to account to make sure that we're living up to those principles. So that's a reflection back, and I think there's a lot of great stuff that has been raised to explore.
That's very good, Alan. So just to be factual for a moment, how many people have signed it? It seems like there has been some additions since we actually started this proposal. Where are we at now?
It is over 61. There are some states that I know are on the verge of announcing their adoption, but I think I would say in the mid 60s is probably a safe bet about where we are.
The mid 60s. Okay. Those are very good years. Yeah. So that you segued right into our next topic, which was the question of why was this a state-to-state initiative as opposed to a broader multi-stakeholder initiative. And I think Regina has some observations about that she can start out with.
Thank you, Milton. Yeah, from my memory, it is basically an intergovernmental declaration because it started as a contribution to the Summit for Democracy. Although in the end it was delayed, so it wasn't ready for the Summit for Democracy, but that's basically the reason why only governments were approached in the first round. It also started with this idea of an alliance. That is what Dhruva also said. Alliance and military allies of the US were among the first group of countries that were approached by the Biden administration. But this term alliance quickly disappeared because it was clear that it's not about us against them or something like that. It's about, recommitting to the principles, and that should be something that is an endeavor that should be open for all states and all governments. I would say the idea to have something on the future of the internet as part of the Summit for Democracy is also something that is very clear and was intuitively clear to me and also to other European interlocutors of the Biden administration, because democracy for digitized societies relies on an open and free and secure internet, both in terms of infrastructure and all the technical and logical layers, but also in terms of content. And this is something where it was absolutely clear that we have to shed a light also on the role of the internet for the democracy. It is there are some issues that are perhaps worth remembering or reminding us that from the initial draft of the Declaration for the Future of the Internet to what we have now, there were several loops that we had, and it's interesting for everybody that to learn a little bit more about that. One of the loops that we had was actually to bring in the European Commission as the negotiating counterpart on the side of the Europeans, because internet governance is basically not one of their main competencies, but remains within the competence of the member states as member states of the United Nations. Then this element of stakeholder involvement also appeared a little bit later. It was decided that the declaration itself is not open to stakeholder participation, but stakeholder involvement as such was amended in the draft, so that this awareness of the role of stakeholders for the future of the internet was then clear to all the signatory partners. And it has experienced also some further development, because the now established tech cohort for the Summit for Democracy is actually a stakeholder format with Access Now and other partners on board. And then something that also came later was the reference that the Declaration for the Future of the Internet is actually also to be coherent and consistent with other framework documents, like, for example, the Freedom Online Coalition or the United Nations documents, also the norms framework that we developed in the United Nations, and other basic documents. So I think that in the process of drafting and editing the declaration, it also from my point of view, very unsatisfying first draft, it became quite a good document in the end, and it's also a useful starting point for further process. I would agree with those of you who have said, okay, because we weren't able to negotiate the document, we are not able to sign it. That is, of course, some part of the process that could perhaps been done better. And for example, Counter Ransomware Initiative is an example of how this could be dealt with in a different way, because this is more about cooperation, actual cooperation, and not about positioning countries positioning themselves in a way, and for the declaration, the process has been underestimated in the beginning, but it has become more important now. We have had an outreach organized by both the US and also the European External Action Service to third countries to invite them to sign on to this declaration, and it has been quite successful, and the increasing number of signatories is proof to that. Part of the process is also that we had a meeting of all the signatories in Prague in early November, something that the European Commission was very keen on organizing, to have also some opportunity to exchange on the state of affairs, because of course countries, governments declared themselves willing to strengthen and to empower the original principles of the internet, but it's once and for all is not enough, so there has to be also a continuous engagement on this. So I think this process aspect is something that we would have to highlight further in the future. But with the text of the declaration, I think we have a very good reference framework. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to now draw in Luis and then Dhruva, if I could. Are we, in some sense, going backwards a bit on multi-stakeholderism? Because I remember this exciting moment in Brazil in 2014, the Net Mundial, which was did involve states. It was a very critical moment, you know, in the wake of the Snowden revelations. On the other hand, I understand the signaling element that Alan mentioned. What is your opinion about the, you know, the future of multi-stakeholderism, given this initiative and the way it's played reasonably well, but still the signatories like Regina are talking about stakeholder involvement, but not participation in actually signing the document. Let's start with Luis, and then I'll turn to Dhruva.
Okay, easy question, right? But I think, yeah, overall, I think, well, just give one comment on context and then kind of go really to the point about like multi-stakeholder. I think we're looking at a field, like if we compare 2014 to today, right? It's a very different landscape of initiatives, a very different landscape in terms of how the topics have grown into specific niche areas. So you have specific forums and processes focusing on cybersecurity, others on AI, and yada, yada, yada. So you have this complexification of the field and specialization of the discussion. So I think we, you know, to some degree, you know, multi-stakeholderism has spread throughout some of these discussions, right? I mean, you see some mentions and processes and initiatives that try to capture more multi-stakeholder participation in these specialized debates, which I think it's great. I think that's something that internet governance kind of like broadcasted, right, in many ways. But I think we, in the context of the declaration, I think we really, I'm going to be the devil's advocate, so I'm going to be a real pragmatist here. We need to consider what it actually means to make something multi-stakeholder, right? I think that has been the crux or existential crises of the internet governance world. Like, what does it mean to actually make something multi-stakeholder or strictly governmental, right? So I'm really glad because Alan said something that's, you know, I think captures very nicely how I thought about the declaration, how I think about the declaration. So if we're thinking about the declaration in terms of political gains, of, you know, of signaling something, of signaling a message in this context that we're living in, and I think the sense of urgency, right, of sending out a message that in this context where there is this notion of a tech clash, that there are geopolitical disputes around that, there's a need to like say that we as liberal democracies, as democracies, we agree that these are the principles. So it's a moment to say it again. So I think in terms of political signaling, if that is the intended effect, I think, you know, as a government-led process, government to government, I think it achieves what it aims to do, you know, in terms of signaling. But if we think about like, if it was a multi-stakeholder process, is the objective actually to signal? I mean, it could be potentially to signal, but it would also be many other things. So in terms of achieving that particular objective, and as I said, I'm being the devil's advocate pragmatist over here, right? In terms of achieving a particular objective, then we might not have that. It's not to say, again, that I don't agree and I don't think that we should think about these declarations and the commitments as something that we're all sharing. But I think in terms of intended purposes of how I interpreted the declaration, I thought it was much more about this signaling than necessarily doing a multi-stakeholder process to actually build the declaration and to have the sign on. And once we have, just compare with like the Paris call. The Paris call is one example of, France / Microsoft kind of coming together and talking to different countries and building like a declaration, let's say, on like peace and security in cyberspace. But then the question is, so how do you move forward, right? In terms of government, it's like, let's get more signatories because that's going back to our political signaling. In terms of multi-stakeholder engagement in a declaration, which is something really like big, in the terms of like the Paris call, they tried to do like multiple working groups, but there's still this question of, okay, we signed up to this. What does that mean in practice, right? Is it just another reference for us to make governments more accountable for what they're doing? Maybe that's the political gain for other stakeholders. So I think that's my kind of overall assessment, let's say, of this tension. I think we need to ask, what does multi-stakeholder do to something, the process such as this, a declaration such as that, and in terms of being realistic about what are the strategic and political interests over there.
Good, thank you. Dhruva, I know that India has a very active civil society on internet issues, and my organization has an employee there, a staff member. There's so much going on in India related to the digital political economy, but the state is taking sometimes a very adversarial stance towards, or the civil society is taking a very adversarial stance towards the state. So how do you see this multi-stakeholderism issue?
Sure. Actually, just firstly, and just in response to some of the other comments, which are very interesting, and it was interesting to see the commonalities and the somewhat different emphases of some of the other speakers on the similar issue. One thing I would mention is one difference I think India would have relative to some of the other countries is less of a concern about the consequences of the geopolitical competition taking place. And in fact, I think you've seen India actually sign on to some principles in the digital space precisely because of that geopolitical competition. So both for example, in the context of the Quad, which is involving India, US, Japan, Australia, but also on digital principles for AI, basic democratic principles for AI, for example, that have been endorsed by the European Commission and many OECD countries. And so there are other examples, I think, of India actually signing on to and participating in some of these initiatives that use very similar language. In fact, I think driven by concerns about similar shared concerns about geopolitical competition, particularly vis-a-vis China. Getting to the question of multi-stakeholderism, it's interesting. You mentioned Net Mundial coming in the immediate wake of the Snowden revelations. But equally, I think the big watershed moment after that was Cambridge Analytica, which came afterwards, which I think really, it's one of many examples, I think really discredited this notion that a lot of essentially the private sector, the corporate sector can govern itself and can be responsible enough to govern itself. And so I think that, this issue that governments do need to play a bigger regulatory role. This can't be a sort of a sandpit in which where regulation follows innovation sometimes lags quite significantly behind innovation, and including initiatives by civil society. So I think as was mentioned already, I think the context has changed significantly. And essentially, I don't say this with a degree necessarily of optimism, but I do think we are, for a variety of reasons, many of which have been discussed already, entering into a stage where national governments will be expected and would expect to play a much bigger role. And while I think certain multi-stakeholder principles will remain, some may even strengthen, and certainly lip service will be paid to many of these initiatives. That really, I think we are entering into a sort of more of a stage of digital nationalism. India is in the process right now of re-litigating or re-legislating a lot of its laws. In fact, there might be some quite sweeping changes to what are quite archaic laws that govern cyberspace and the internet broadly in India over the next few months, possibly into next year. So I think it's a bad timing in some ways. We're at a stage where we're just going to see very significant changes to legislation. And so a lot will depend on how that plays out. And like a lot of legislation, this has been open to comment by outside actors as well. So let's see how this plays out. But I fear the trend will generally be in response to, in a post GDPR, in that kind of world. I think we're moving in a particular direction.
Henriette, you wanted to get in on this.
Just briefly, Milton, I think there is a need for principles. I think there is a need for governments to be more engaged. I think the idea that we have one fully integrated global internet governance, that system that's multi-stakeholder, that's simply naive. It doesn't work that way. I think what we do need is multi-stakeholder engagement in our separate initiatives. I would have liked to see this as a government-led initiative, but to seek more input from other stakeholders in the process. I think in terms of the document, I think it goes a little bit beyond principles, and I think it is signaling a message. I mean, it's positive for governments to signal a message like this because there's so much regulation happening at the moment, perhaps too quickly in some places, and having principles that can be used to evaluate and harmonize that regulation, I think, is useful. But I think this document goes beyond that. I think it also signals a geopolitical message. It uses the concept of like-minded and democratic. Now, this is immediately language that makes it very difficult for states to align themselves with this document. So I think that if this was a message that was trying to signal governments wanting to establish common principles to protect the publicness of the internet, to respect human rights, I think that's quite positive. I would have liked them to develop it in a more inclusive way. But I think to signal that message with geopolitical coded messages between the lines actually can set us back in terms of having those very principles respected globally at national level, which I think as a multi-stakeholder internet governance community, we really would like.
Milton, if I can add some remarks on that. You should also not underestimate the heterogeneity within governments, because, for example, diplomats are always at the forefront of international cooperation and also multi-stakeholderism. It's within our DNA to talk to others and to kind of align ourselves and find the biggest possible common denominator. But then in all governments, it's the same. I mean, digital ministries then come in, or economic ministries or finance ministries with also some interest in international cooperation. But then the more inward-looking ministries and departments like interior, security, and for them, some of the principles to be found in the Declaration for the Futures of the Internet are really hard work to accept. So I think the signaling goes both ways within the international community to those who are still not part of the like-mindedness, as Henriette said, but also within our own governments and to our own civil societies that we are really willing to take this seriously.
So Henriette sort of raised the elephant in the room, which is this like-minded question. Is this a tool in a geopolitical competition? It seemed to me that the evolution of the document really moved away from that to a certain degree by dropping the alliance language, but maybe Alan can comment on that. You know, the US, well, Dhruva spoke of digital nationalism, which I, you know, in our research center thinks is a really undermining and destructive thing in general. And we do think that India is going in that direction in certain ways. We know that certain countries are promoting digital sovereignty, and even the European Commission or the European Union is using that term, and the US is as guilty as any other, just having imposed a bunch of restrictions on equipment sales and services from its adversary or its perceived adversary, China. So Alan, what are we trying to get out of that, or are we reinforcing it with the declaration?
It's a great question. Let me maybe take a half step back first and just address some of the great points that have been made so far. And I would say, you know, to the question about this being a government to government document, I would just say, you know, in many ways that was a known bug, as we say, a known bug from the start. That there would always be limitations in trying to do a government-to-government document and to do it relatively quickly, as was the desire. And as Regina noted, I do think the document improved substantially with input, and with more time might have also improved more. But I think in some ways it was the best that could be done in a short period. And I think we and many of the signatories remain very proud of the content of the document, even if the process could have been improved. You know, the hope is, of course, that there is a very, you know, also robust place for multi-stakeholder governance with it, even as we were moving forward in this government-to-government conversation. And I think that's enshrined in the document. The signaling point that Luisa raised and others raised, I think, is quite important. That was quite the goal of this document, a statement of principles, taking a stand at a moment when people were questioning where many governments stood on these issues. And it is very in its support of these broad principles. You know, the signaling point and the question of like-mindedness does also go to this question of how to, I think there was a conscious effort to make sure this was a document that had some teeth, right? This wasn't a document that I think the signatories did not want a document that just anybody could sign on to, right? The notion is a strong sense of belief in these principles around human rights, access, multi-stakeholderism, the other things that trust that are enshrined in the document. And so, yes, in many ways, it is a document that sets out to differentiate and to say that those who sign are making a binding commitment to these principles. Because going forward, and we think about what is the potential role here, I think it's quite important to look at the substance. Did we miss? Did we get it right? And then to bind states to these commitments. It enshrines a role for civil society and the private sector, the technical community, academia, and other stakeholders to work to get more states into these principles, and then to hold states to account for the principles afterwards. And that's very much what I think we wanted.
I think I agree with you that, and let me shoot that back to Henriette. It's kind of a damned if you do and damned if you don't situation here. If the principles are such that there's no like-mindedness, then they're kind of meaningless, right? If you know, if North Korea can sign on to the principles, what do they really mean? On the other hand, if you are defining principles that some countries cannot agree with, then you're in this trap of sort of creating an exclusive group of like-minded states who are adhering to these principles. So, Henriette, how would you navigate that tension? Or anybody on
I
the
think,
panel
yeah,
can.
others can respond as well. I think that, I mean, what does like-minded really mean? I mean, like-minded in many, how is that term like-minded often used? It's used for coalitions, for blocs. It's very rarely connected to the actual values and principles that are practiced at national level. Hungary signed onto this, for example. So, but Milton, to get back to that, I think it's a good idea. I think it's good that governments are willing to commit to uphold these principles. But I think we need to be realistic. Look at the Freedom Online Coalition. It has not actually succeeded in systematically getting its assigned states, its member states, to apply principles of online freedom effectively. I think for civil society to use this document to hold countries accountable. In fact, I think it'd be very useful to start with the US maybe even and do an analysis. I think it would produce useful evidence. But to do that consistently when civil society already has to hold states accountable for complying with international human rights agreement within the United Nations system and other treaties that they are signatories to. So I think over the longer term, I'm not sure that it's feasible, but maybe in this period where we are in transition, we're beginning to rethink about how approaching self-regulation, co-regulation, regional regulation. I think having a list of principles and checks and balances that can prevent overreach through regulation and still help us meet the intended objectives of that regulation could be useful, but I think it would have to really be approached in a more multi-stakeholder way than this. And I think civil society would like to participate in that. I think many would. I can't speak for all, but I think the long-term feasibility of this and what the end game really is would need to be quite a lot clearer than it is right now.
Can I jump in on that, Milton?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just really quickly, I think it's nice that Henriette ended on that point. So on the point of like-mindedness, at least how I think about it, it could be in layers of like-mindedness, right? So you could go for, let's say, Five Eyes, then allies, then like-minded and the extended family, and then just expand. So layers of different partners, right? And I think that's good. And there's all the types of like-mindedness, in terms of the concept, right? But when thinking about the DFI, I think it's interesting that in spite of the language, you still see like 60 plus countries signing to it, right? So again, I'm playing the realist here, like the pragmatist. So in terms of doing that, I think it's a stakeholder mapping effort of like who's actually on board in terms of, this, are we still agreeing with this? Are these still principles that resonate? So in spite of the allies term, which could be interpreted in multiple ways, there's still buy-in. So I think that is quite interesting to observe from like a research standpoint and as a scholar kind of like looking at these dynamics. And it's also a trust building effort, right? It's not just about signaling, but I think it's also about creating trust with countries that are kind of in this middle ground. I think that's the biggest challenge, at least as someone in cyber, looking at different like cybersecurity processes. I think the biggest challenge, especially for, Western democracies, is how to communicate with those countries in the middle, right? And I think that's something quite interesting to observe, just looking at the list of, let's say, LAC or Latin American countries, right, that have signed up for that. We could extend that. And finally, I think in terms of of where it wants to get to, I think we need to be open that it's not just about one specific output. It's not a linear process, but it's part of a wider process of signaling, right? In this geopolitical context. So it's not just one single strategy, but it's part of like, how do we build that? How do we reference that also across different initiatives that mutually support each other, right? Think about, as has been said previously, like the Freedom Online Coalition, the declaration. So these different institutionalized models, be it narratives or just like institutions or processes, they mutually strengthen each other as reference points. So I think that's also part of what's been observed here. And I think that's actually quite positive to see the whole process from that particular lens.
All right, Alan, you have your hand up.
Thank you, and I just wanted to maybe echo or underscore what Luis just said. Just in the sense that arguably it was the substance that attracted the signatories, right? Countries have signed on to this because of the language, and maybe despite the somewhat flawed process, right? And I do want to just say, I agree, it is a cause for some celebration. That we were able to get this broad group of countries, and hopefully a growing group of countries, to sign on to this language that enshrines and reaffirms our commitment to these broad principles. And I will say, as somebody who's been in this space also for a while, I'm not sure that 20 years ago we would have gotten this broad group of signatories to sign a document like this. And I don't know what you think, Milton. I'm encouraged by it, including the embrace of multi-stakeholderism, including the additions, and it's interesting to watch the evolution of these documents over time, the inclusion of trust as a major theme here, and the growing need to hold to account corporations as well as governments, I think is an interesting evolution that we should be watching. Hopefully we can focus on the substance going forward and look at, where we can lift it up, how we can get more people on. And as I say, make sure that we're all then doing on the government side, what we need to do to further the principles. But it's, I think it's quite something on the substance.
That's an interesting question. Could you have done this 20 years ago? I would be interested in mapping the signatories to the people who did and did not sign on to the ITRs in the WICET in 2013, 2012. That would be interesting to compare, and also would be interesting to compare it to possibly the net mundial agreements or some of the similar things from that period. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Andreas, and he's going to be managing the questions that we're getting from the floor and from the chat from online. So I have no idea what's going on in the room, so I will turn it over to Andreas. Let him do the hard work.
Thank you, Milton, and thank you, everyone. This has been a fascinating, really insightful conversation. There are a couple of questions that came up in the chat throughout the discussion that I want to briefly bring up, and then panelists can briefly respond to that. And also see a couple of hands up in the online environment. We'll try to bring them in as well. And also want to quickly check with the IGF on the ground if it's possible to bring people on the floor in for questions. But let's get started with some of the questions that came up throughout the chat. I think one very pertinent question is basically getting insights from the panel about what are very concrete actions, kind of like, next steps. We talked about next steps in terms of process to extend the group of signatories. But I think the other part is like, what are concrete actions that can be taken to take, the initiative or the declaration forward and do more just than beyond signaling. I think that's one that came up because okay, very concrete points and actions. And the other one was like, and I think it's a very important one, is like, how does that fit into the broader conversation or what's happening in terms of like cyberspace as a digital battleground, military intelligence operations? How is that consistent with what we want to bring forward? Is it consistent, or is it just like, that's just what it is? How should we think about that? I think those are two big questions that came up. And then I know that Andre flagged that Marek has a really good question, but I'm not sure if that was, I think that was just a response to a previous text there. So those 2 points I raised, if someone on the panel wants to go first in addressing them, and then I'll bring in Isan Mokaberi who have raised their hands for asking questions. Who would like to go first?
Hello?
Andrea, we also have some hands in the room, just so you are aware.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Andrea. Let's maybe quickly those two questions that I posed before about the practical ways to move things forward, and about how we do with the military intelligence activities in cyberspace, and are they consistent with
Andreas, I can try and answer the first one, which I kind of did in the chat as well. In the chat, someone from the UK government asked, what can we do? I think if signatories would like to use these principles to engage in public open review processes of recent legislation, I think that could be really dynamic. We have the UK Online Safety Bill, for example. There's already been a lot of public engagement in that piece of legislation, but looking at that and facilitating a process, using forums like the IGF, but also using national and regional IGFs to have those kind of conversations. I think that's one idea. I think the other idea came up in the chat from Jorge Cancio from Switzerland, and that is to look at updating or revising or creating a new version of it that's more inclusive of other stakeholders. I think another idea that I think would be good would be to use the IGF. We have in the IGF a broad commitment to principles of multi-stakeholder participation. We do have a recognition of the applicability of rights that apply offline, also apply online through the Human Rights Council resolution, but we haven't really in the IGF community yet negotiate's the wrong term, dialogued and debated through what our common principles are about how we think the internet should be governed. So I think that could also be something that's useful for us as the IGF community, but in a multi-stakeholder way, to really work through these principles and reflect on what they mean for this particular community and to what extent we want to prioritize them. And then finally, there's the Global Digital Compact. But I think you'll come to that later, Milton. But there's an opportunity of a multilateral UN process with some multi-stakeholder participation. And again, I think it could be possible for member states in this declaration, signatories, to submit that content, but also maybe for others to use that as a starting point for developing principles that they feel more ownership of to put into the Global Digital Compact process.
Thank you, Andrea. That was excellent. Alan raised his hands, and if other panelists would like to join afterwards with respond, just please raise your hands as well. Thank you.
Yeah, just to continue on Andrea's excellent points, I'd just say, just in terms of moving forward practically, this is, I think, always been viewed as a starting point from our perspective, and a number of different areas to move forward. Three quick things. One is, we hope to continue to engage with governments in terms of thinking about getting additional signatories. And the Prague event that was hosted by the European Commission was a great example of that. I think we are all open to more signatories, and I hope that folks will speak to work with their governments and try to get them into signing up for these principles, which we think are so important. A second is, as Henrietta said, I think this very big role for the multi-stakeholder community now, hopefully to use these, to hone these, to discuss its own feelings about these. Part of the excitement about being here and part of IGF is to think about the role that IGF itself could play in discussing these principles and hopefully using them and holding us to account. And then I'll say, just from a pure U.S. perspective, I think it is on us in the government then, having signed up for these principles, to try to make them real. And as someone said, governments are not monoliths. And as one player within a large government, principles like this give us an opportunity to go out there and say, these are things we need to stand for. This government in the United States, we are working hard on things like our executive order on competition, our executive order recently on signals intelligence. I lead an organization that is working very hard to make sure that we have good internet access to connect the unconnected. And we have a large infrastructure project here, $50 billion to connect the unconnected. Making this real on the ground has to be part of the path forward too.
Thank you, Ellen. Luis, very briefly, and then I'd like to bring in some people from the panel on the ground.
For sure. Just responding to the second question, if I got it correctly, I think, from let's say a cybersecurity, let's say more national security, let's say perspective, or international peace and security perspective on the cybersecurity side of things, I think, there are some elements within the declaration that are echoing, agreements on cyber norms, basically, responsible state behavior in cyberspace. So for example, refrain using the internet to undermine electoral infrastructure. I mean, this would be extended to like cyber attacks and whatnot. And I think the other one is refraining from undermining the technical infrastructure that is essential to the general availability of and integrity of the internet. So I think these are potentially crossovers, but I think there are thorny issues going forward, right, to consider, especially from states that, have greater capacities and capabilities on, let's say, on the cyber operations side of things, to understand, how to ensure that these kinds of commitments go through the spectrum, not just at the high level, but thinking at what does it mean at the operational level to uphold these kinds of commitments when conducting, let's say, a particular kind of operation, cyber operation. So just wanted to respond to that comment.
Thank you so much. I'm glad we covered that as well. Andrea, can you help us with bringing some people on the floor? I don't have much visibility from my end.
Yes, Andreas, Regine wants to respond, and then I'll take it to the people. I think there are about 4 hands in the room.
Excellent. Let's do that. Thank you so much.
Okay, just briefly on the way forward, and basically on both questions. The first one, militarization of cyberspace. This is actually something that has become increasingly urgent to discuss with the Russian war against Ukraine, because this takes place also in cyberspace. And we obviously need some more common understanding on the application of international humanitarian law to cyberspace. And I hope that the current open-ended working group will help us to develop some more language. We didn't succeed in the last round, so I hope we can take it up again. Then some other forum where next steps are to be taken is the development of the Global Digital Compact, of course, and this will be truly inclusive because it will be a UN document with everybody on board. So definitely also something that Luis said before, a document to hold governments also accountable. It will be, again, a government-to-government document signed by governments only and not by other stakeholders. But stakeholders are invited in the process. There are open consultations going on. The deadline has also been extended, so still room for bringing in some arguments. Germany, for example, will be hosting regional consultations in Kenya, in Mexico, and in India in the next month, also in a multi-stakeholder format for the tech envoy. And the IGF itself is also an opportunity to come up with some building blocks for the Global Digital Compact. My fear is that although we will have this broad involvement of stakeholders, the Global Digital Compact remains paper. And that is what I really fear. So I'm completely with the tech envoy, who already today focuses on the implementation of the Global Digital Compact. And that is the moment where it will not work without the other stakeholders, the non-governmental stakeholders.
Thanks, Regine. So Andreas, there's 2 hands there, and I think 1 hand there, 2 hands on this side. Just introduce yourselves and try and be brief, please.
Hi, I'm Moira Whalen from the National Democratic Institute in Washington. So thank you for this session, because it is by far the engagement on this issue as robust as we have seen it to this point. And I wanted to first acknowledge a few things about the process and then put questions on for those who are signatories to get some clarity on this process. The first is around the question of process and the idea of civil society engagement. It is not true that there was not civil society engagement in the development of this. It was informal and aggressive. And to try to force it into this framework. So happy to go into detail on that, but I think it's an important note for my fellow civil society colleagues to know that the INGO community in Washington was deeply engaged in trying to reroute this process. Second on that, I think we go to the process element of implementation. So I welcome the idea that it is a state-to-state agreement and that civil society can now be in the role of holding people accountable. But I point back to that accessibility of how to hold people accountable. If we aren't invited to the meeting in Prague, we don't have dates for when progress points will be reported. We don't have any acknowledgement of any way to meaningfully contribute, even an email address. That makes the role of civil society that's challenging for us to be able to do that in a meaningful way. And I would point to the fact that our government colleagues have pointed us to other products and other mechanisms as ways to contribute rather than this one. So I would like some evidence on that one. The second is around this process of buy-in and I'd be interested in understanding the evidence we have around the signatory countries signing on because of the substance. There are other incentives that are in it for them, one being money. That as an implementing partner, we see very meaningfully when we're asked by governments to support them in their path on this. And the second being the Summit for Democracy and their attendance on that. The third, of course, being reputational and a fig leaf for countries that may not be as rights respecting as others. So I'd really love some really detailed explanation on what the mechanisms are for us to participate, as well as the metrics on buy-in. That would be really useful.
Thank you so much. And Andrea, do you mind kind of like get all these other questions in as well?
Yes,
So because
yes.
in the interest of time, thank you so much.
I think they're self-organizing.
Self-organizing. Hi, thank you. It's Paul. I'm in the private sector. Let me preface by saying that I'm firmly in the school of thought that I hold governments and countries that take criticism in high regard, and I have a great love for the Biden administration. So let me state it like this. This particular declaration, I think, has got some very good content, but unfortunately, I think there's a lot of boneheadedness in this process and so on. And I think that arises because there are two, or more than two, at least two, objectives that the administration was coming with, and that it's an early administration political project, and that has caused a little bit of an objective creep problem. And I think what we've sort of got to look at is this whole notion of trying to build a coalition around, U.S. Foreign policy and so on, and the idea of creating a set of internet norms can quickly become, in contested space. What would be very useful for civil society, for the private sector, what would be very useful for intergovernmental, relations moving forward, of course, is if all member states of the UN were to actually make a declaration of their aspirations, their intent, and their vision of the internet, because it being put in the words of one country or one process doesn't actually tell you all that much. So I actually think, from the perspective of being a signal of what the US believes, what the current administration of the United States is, this document is great. As an expression of a coalition, it fails, and of course it had to pull back from trying to be a coalition. So I would, to be quite honest, I'm of the view that a better course forward would actually be to either through the UN General Assembly, or just the Secretary General for that matter, but would be to actually seek from every UN member state a declaration in that state's own words of what its aspirations, what it sees, and what its commitments to an open internet are. Because, it doesn't help if we've got countries signing onto a document that they don't mean. And it's very helpful to know which states aren't committed to a global internet or an open internet in any event. It makes it an easier field. So, like I said, I think the document has good intent, but I think there was an objective creep. And I think we should, look at a way of getting the deliberative stuff outside of this sort of a document and more in an IGF process. And we should invite countries to make a declaration in their own words, and that is seen as a commitment that we hold them to moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Okay, so I'm Yi Chen from the Beijing Normal University, also from the Oxford Global.
Just introduce yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, my name is Yi Chen Chun. I'm both from the Oxford Global Society Associate Fellow and also from the Beijing Normal University. So I have a question and also comment. I mean, this last year IGF we had this discussion about with Tim Wu, online about this Declaration of Future Internet. I think I was surprised Milton didn't invite any Chinese delegate to join the panel, and because at the time I think I asked whether China can sign this declaration, and Tim Wu said that of course China can sign it. Okay, so my point is that from the very beginning, we all noticed that this is a obviously, a geopolitical driven initiative. Of course, with time goes by, it become more, have the input from the European unions and also from the consultation stages from other countries. But it cannot, erase or cover up the political motivation right from the very beginning, because in the declaration, it says that it explicitly says that this is a statement from like-minded and also democratic country, which is automatically excluded a lot of countries, like a country from the Middle East, from China, and from Russia, and from other countries. So my question is, what is the purpose of this declaration? This purpose is to intensify the geopolitical contestation in the cyberspace, or further fragmented the global internet governance, or is to improve the international collaboration. And secondly, will this undermine the global efforts we joined into the UN process, for example, the Global Digital Compact? So that's my questions. What's the purpose for this?
Just one more.
Okay, that's the last one. We have about 10 minutes left. Maybe please keep the question to less than a minute if possible. And then I would like to hand over back to Milton for also some final remarks, but also give the panelists a chance to briefly respond to some of those questions.
Hello, could I ask my question, please?
Amir Hossein, you were not given the floor. Please, could you wait? Can you take the floor? There's someone in the room, Amir.
Sure. Good day, whichever part of the time zone you're in. My name is Matthew Matt Norton from an organization called the Roots Foundation in Kingston, Jamaica. Jamaica is one of the signatories. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Jamaican government. This is my first IGF. And I think one of the interesting things that I have observed in this space, or one of the questions I'm taking away, is whether we've, as a community, have given up a commitment to working on and protecting an unfragmented internet space. And I ask that question because there's a number of sessions that I've joined, but looking at this specific document, it's not clear to me that the declaration of values by like-minded actors is better for achieving an open, unfragmented internet than not. And so it's very similar to what was commented before, but I'm generally curious from the panelists as to whether this is something that we are really trying to achieve, or are we simultaneously trying to create an internet for a particular group of actors, and then obviously there's going to be an internet for another different group of actors, and what that might mean for how we progress.
Thank you so much. And I do apologize. I know there are additional questions. We won't be able to get to them in order to get the panelists a chance to actually respond to some of those questions. But please, to have them on the record, can you please just put your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get them as well. I apologize for that. But Milton, back to you so we can wrap up the panel and get the chance to address some of them. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that to wrap up the panel, what we need to do is have maybe some of the speakers respond to the comments that were made. I think, and if Mr. Makaberry would make a very short intervention, I think we have time for that. We've got until 8:35, so why don't we go ahead with Mr. Makaberry, and if you keep it short, then Mr. Khan can also speak. So let's see what we get here.
Hello, Can I ask my question?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miller, for giving me the floor. I'll keep it short. Hello, everyone. My question to Mr. Alan Davidson is, what is the position of DFI on these critical issues? The first issue is issue of nature and characteristics of internet as a peaceful, civilian-only and development-oriented environment for global public good, as mentioned in research outcome, WSIS outcome, not as a new battlefield and militarized environment. Second issue is element of responsibility of a state for the misbehaviors of their digital platform in other countries and the accountability framework for cross-border digital platform in other jurisdictions. The third issue is what is the relation between DFI and inclusive internet or coalition-like internet? And another issue is international.
Hold on, not so many issues. Just limit the issues.
Yeah, and the last one is internationalization of ICANN as an important confidence and trust-building measure. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to raise my issue. Thanks.
Okay, Mr. Khan, quickly, please.
Thank you. Just a very quick comment and observation, particularly pertaining to India. So I just wanted to add some more context and sort of partially disagree with what Drew was saying in terms of the characterization of what India has been doing so far. So I'm sure most people will be aware of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which put forward an international code of conduct and information security that made primacy of digital sovereignty as the foundation of internet governance going forward. And that was in 2011 and subsequently put forward in 2015. India joined in 2017. So I disagree with the fact that just because they weren't on the table, that doesn't necessarily mean that they wouldn't sign up to certain kinds of agreements. In fact, I think the substance, following on from what Alan had said, was the key issue, given that India previously using the IBSA proposal in 2011 on bringing forward internet-related governance issues to the UN instead of multi-stakeholder proposals. And given the fact that India leads in internet shutdowns and has increased criticism on surveillance laws and things like that, I think that they just decided that the text of the declaration was not suited to their own sort of domestic needs. And I think this is a consequence of the fact their views have been sort of excluded potentially from multi-stakeholder platforms. And I think this might be the case for other nations where most multi-stakeholder platforms like ICANN could be comprised of mostly Western interests. So I just wanted to add that context. Thank you.
Very good. Would you like to respond to that, Dhruva?
Yeah, no, look, I think there are a couple of things at play. I'm not sure the SEO example is a very good one because India joined the SEO subsequently as a full member. But some of it, as somebody mentioned earlier, the governments are not monoliths. And I'm just recalling, for example, some of the negotiations. India took very different positions, for example, at Wicket and at Net Mundial, in part because different parts of the government were taking the lead on negotiating those. So that sometimes is what is at play there. But again, just to emphasize, I think on some of the substantive issues, again, you've seen actually greater convergence of Indian interests, of at least on principles, again, in the context of the Quad and on AI and some other issues. But on other cases, as I mentioned as well, I think we're going in a very different direction, largely because both for national security concerns, and I think a lot of it has to do with India-China competition in particular. And the second has to do with, I think, some of the economic opportunities that I think are being seen as stacked against India, and in some sense, I think is also contributing to the push for digital sovereignty.
Good. So I thought that the comments of, I think it was Ms. Whalen from NDI were very interesting. Did any of the panelists want to talk about that? She asserted that there was, in fact, significant consultation with the civil society, but that she had some concerns about follow-up. And I think I'd be happy to let our final couple of minutes be occupied by somebody who could respond to that. Alan?
Thanks, Milton. And I would start by saying I appreciate Maura's comment about the fact that there was, in fact, a fair amount of civil society engagement, especially as the process grew up past the Summit for Democracy, that initial push. And my sense is that, you know, it greatly improved the product. And you see that in the substance that was put out. I think we're also some of the other comments that were made, and perhaps not enough process, but again, I think there was some. You know, we're always open to hearing about our boneheadedness within the government. I would take issue though with the notion that this was a U.S. driven or a U.S. only effort. There were many countries over time, 60 plus signatories when announced. I was at the signing ceremony, and I can tell you there was great passion in many of the countries that signed and spoke about the value of these principles. So I would not reduce their contributions by saying this is a U.S. document. It's not. And we hope to make it a much broader document. And I'd say just then looking forward, you know, the document has a key embrace of multi-stakeholderism. That's by intent. And I'm excited to be here and to be part of this conversation in the spirit of that multi-stakeholderism. And I think there is a major role for IGF and other organizations. I'd be quite interested to see what this community thinks it can do with this document as a starting point and where it can take it. And the final thing I'll say to some of the last questions was, we do believe that in the unfragmented internet. We also believe that a community internet that stands for these values. And there's no mistake here. This document, this declaration takes a normative stand. It is a set of countries who are standing for a set of principles in support of an open, free, global, interoperable, reliable, secure internet. And there will be countries that will probably not want to sign up for those principles. And we should know that. But that's not taking away from the fact that this is a strong statement of values. We hope it is a contribution to the internet governance conversation over time. It'll be quite interesting to see how it feeds into how the IGF uses it. Hopefully it is a good setup for the Global Digital Compact. And we're very proud to be standing for these values as we move forward on the open internet. So thank you for having us, and thank you for this conversation, Milton, and everybody who contributed.
Yes, I think it was a very good interaction, and indeed it does indicate the complexity, the messiness, but the cooperative nature of internet governance as it now stands, with some people questioning the value of the IGF, but here's a forum in which the governments can go off and do something, and we can bring them, and they're willing to talk to us, to be criticized by us, and to be possibly influenced by how we move forward with this initiative. But there's still a lot to be said. I like the idea that was floated that the declaration could continue to be brought into future IGFs in terms of gaining more support and more discussion of those principles. And I think this has been a very constructive session. I appreciate Regina and Alan as main signatories. I appreciate Dhruv and Henriette and Luis as our critics, and thank you also to Andreas for helping, working hard to set this up. So that's it. We're out of time, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Thanks for joining.
Milton. Thanks,
Bye.
Andreas.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.